Hey, I'm Sarah. This is Thrills and Kills Booktube, where we talk about horror, thriller, and true crime. Today, I'm talking about cults. Have you been stressed out lately? Are you in the midst of a transition, like a breakup, a new job, or a move? Do you think you're someone who's sort of unassertive or maybe a little bit gullible? Are you disillusioned with the way that the world is going? If so, congratulations, you are more susceptible to joining a cult than the average person. Like many of you, I am fascinated by cults, by the psychology of it all. What makes someone want to join a cult? Who is more vulnerable and more likely to join a cult? And why don't they just leave when things start getting weird? I spent a lot of time looking into psychology and sociology, research and journal articles, trying to understand these questions. I'm really trying to do this topic justice, and so I have poured over all kinds of literature and resources for you guys. I want to approach this with empathy and not just label everyone who joins a cult as some sort of weirdo or crazy person. Many times, people are lured under false pretenses when they are at their most vulnerable, and cult leaders know this, and they know what tactics to deploy in order to take advantage of these people. And many times, group members are being abused in many different ways, and it's very hard for them to get out. So because of this, I really want to make sure we do this topic justice and we maintain a sense of empathy throughout this video, and then a sort of discussion happening in the comments. I would appreciate that. Because of the vast amount of research out there and how much there is to discuss about cults, this video is going to be part one, where we talk about what distinguishes a cult, what sort of tactics do they use, what language do they use, and how do they come to power. I'll make a follow-up video where we talk about specific cults, and I can make recommendations for podcasts, for docuseries or movies, and then books, both fiction and nonfiction, about cults in general, but also about specific cults that you may have heard of. Okay, first, let's discuss the basics of cults. So in general, what are they? How do they work? Basically, a cult is what's called a high demand group or movement. They are started by an individual who claims to have the way or the secrets or all of the answers for a certain question for people. And they will share it with you if you relinquish your thought control. These leaders are so charismatic that they are able to get people to hand over their independent decision making and to really surrender and obey them. Cults tend to operate under a totalitarian leadership style, and they have very strict rules. They also tend to be elitist, and they convey this sense of power and sense of specialness. So think about like a saints versus sinners paradigm, or us versus them, good versus evil. But cults are always going to promote the interests of the leader. That could be money, power, etc. And they are always going to try to grow in a way to further the interests of their leader. They don't actually make the interests and the needs of their own members a priority. It's always about the leader. So how do they go about recruiting people? Well, cults follow a very specific recruitment style, no matter what cult you're looking at. They always use deception, or like a bait and switch tactic. They are not upfront about the end game, and cult members tend to be really far in before they find out what they've actually signed up for. If we think about Scientology, if you've watched any sort of documentary about Scientology, in the beginning, they think it's all about self-improvement, and it's not until they've spent so much money and there are multiple levels within before the actual truth and the full picture of their beliefs are unveiled, and they start learning about the aliens, we'll say. And so sometimes, or a lot of times, people have this sunk cost fallacy where they've spent money, or they've quit their job, or they have isolated themselves from their circle of friends and family, and they feel like they are too far in to turn back now. All right, let's talk about this field of study of cults. This is not just a fringe interest. This is today a legitimate field of study for sociologists and psychologists. So the formal study of cults didn't really start until about the 1930s. There was a sociologist named Max Weber who sort of pioneered this research field. He and his colleagues were initially interested in fringe religious groups, and in some of their research, they even called them deviant religious groups. And they specifically focused on groups where there was tension between the members of the group and the general culture of the time. So a lot of people will wonder, okay, well then what's the difference between a religion and a cult? And I really tried to find the research around this because I want to be respectful of those who are religious. Now, in an organized religion, the focus is on a god or gods, but in a cult, the focus is on the leader themselves. But there are some blurry lines between the two because if you think about it, every religion in human history at some point started off as a fringe or obscure group. And there are many times, again, in human history where brand new religions were viewed as a cult. In most recent times, we would think of the Mormon religion. Okay, so this field of study didn't really take off until like the 1960s and 1970s. So in the 1960s, there was a real boom in the psychology field of the study of human behavior. So not even cults, just general human behavior. The Milgram study is sort of like the landmark study here. As researchers were learning more about human behavior and thought processes, that interest then transferred onto cults and like the deviation of normal human behavior. And then that continued with the study of the counterculture and hippies, as we would know them, through the 60s and 70s. There was a researcher named John Laughlin who was one of the first big cult researchers, and he really brought a lot of credence to this field of study to make it seen as legitimate. He focused on something called the American Unification Church, and he has a landmark book that he wrote, which was called the Doomsday Cult Book. And like I mentioned, this interest in cults really peaked in the 1970s during what was called the cult craze, and how there was like a counterculture going on, hippies, the rise of drug use, that sort of a thing. This all sort of happened around the same time. What really got it going, though, was the rise of sort of new age beliefs or like non-traditional religious beliefs and spirituality, rather than people, especially young people, following a traditional organized religion. Okay, so how many cults are out there? There are rough estimates depending what research and what resource you're looking at, but I did find something that said in 2018 there were up to 10,000 distinct cults in the US alone. Now they tend to be pretty small because they want to try and stay secretive, fly under the radar, and not bring attraction to themselves. All right, so today though, the FBI has categorized cults into 6 different subcategories. And although there are 6 different types, many cults will fall into more than one of these categories. So let's talk about that. The first is what's called destructive cults. And this is where members will either physically hurt themselves or actually even hurt people outside of the cult. They focus on totalitarian systems of governance and leadership and have very strict rules. They also tend to focus on making as much money however they can. But again, not for the members, for the cult leader. The second type is doomsday cults. Sort of like what it sounds. These groups believe in a coming apocalypse, and they will either predict a coming apocalypse or sometimes even outright try to cause it. But usually they're just trying to make meaning or to make sense out of large-scale global events occurring. So these cults tend to proliferate, and their activity tends to increase around things such as wars or pandemics. The third type is called a political cult. Just like the name implies, these tend to focus around political activity and ideology, and these can actually happen on both ends of the political spectrum. However, in recent years, things like QAnon is probably the most popular or well-known political cult that we're aware of. The fourth type is the polygamous cult. There's been lots of docuseries on Netflix recently about polygamous cults, and it's pretty obvious what this is referring to, but it's estimated that there's around 50,000 members in North America alone, and really sadly, they tend to include a lot of abuse, mainly of children. The fifth type is categorized as racist, Cults, again, pretty obvious what that means. These really rose during the 19th and 20th century. Think about the KKK or the Nazis. And the sixth and final is considered terrorist cults. Again, pretty obvious what that's referring to. This is also considered a subgenre of a destructive cult because their number one goal is to harm people. Think about Al-Qaeda. They also tend to believe that the ends justify the means. Okay, now that we've defined cults and talked about the various subgroups, let's talk more about the characteristics. So I found this really interesting checklist, and it came from the International Cultic Studies Association, which they're a very good resource. Lots of links to different research articles and videos and other resources for cult survivors. And this is called the Cult Characteristic Checklist. So this is how to tell if you are part of a high pressure thought control type of a group that may or may not be a cult. So these are just some things to look out for. Number one would be focus on a leader and the requirement for zealous and unquestioning commitment from its group members. Is it preoccupied with bringing in new members and preoccupied with bringing in money at the expense of its current members, requiring total conformity where questioning, doubt, and dissent is punished or discouraged? Does the group use mind-numbing techniques, things like required chanting and meditation, or even speaking in tongues for some groups? Is the leader dictating decisions both big and small? So what kind of clothing you wear and what you're eating for dinner, all the way up to are you allowed to get married and have children? Does the group instill a sense of elitism, either of the leader, its members, or both? And does it instill an us versus them mentality, good versus evil, and creating friction and conflict with the greater society? Another characteristic is having a leader who is not accountable to any authority, and that the rules don't necessarily apply to them, no matter how hypocritical that might seem. And if they do break their own rules or the group's rules, there is no punishment for them. Does this group teach that because of their special status that their ends justify the means, and in that regard starts to normalize what you might have otherwise thought was unethical conduct? Are leaders using guilt to control their members? Are members starting to be isolated from their friends and family and told that they can only socialize with or live with other members of the group? Are they required to give up their personal goals and outside hobbies? Is there an expectation that they are to spend all of their time with the group? So if a group is hitting a few too many of those characteristics, you might want to look into whether it's a cult or not, and whether you or your friend needs help. Let's talk about who is more likely to join a cult. And we talked about this at the beginning. There are some characteristics that make someone more vulnerable than the average population. So things like, did you have a recent transition, like a breakup? Did you move across the country? Did you get a new job? Are you going through a stressful time in your life? Are you someone who tends to be unassertive or gullible or naive? Are you idealistic? Do you tend to be someone who likes to be dependent on other people? Someone who's wanting simple answers to the complex questions out in the world? Or someone who is disillusioned with the way the greater world is going or is currently operating? Or if you've had a recent traumatic experience. These are all individual characteristics that make someone more vulnerable to falling prey to a cult. So a little bit more about who is making up cult membership. It tends to be people who have low self-esteem, and interestingly, about 70% of cult members worldwide are women. It also tends to be people who have higher educational levels, higher financial abilities, and they tend to reject mainstream religion, or maybe they grew up with a mainstream religion and are just disillusioned with it. Basically, intelligent young people, maybe from a sheltered religious upbringing, and they're looking for something more. They're looking for personal identity, a sense of community or connection. So think about the circumstances on the global scale in the last few years, how isolated people have been feeling, impacts of the pandemic and higher inflation and many other things on mental health. And people might be feeling lost, like they don't really have a sense of community. And if you're someone who already deals with stress or low self-esteem, or you've had some changes in your life, you can see how someone who knows how to look out for those vulnerable people, can pick on them, and when they're really at their lowest point, suck them into a cult. So this is why I feel like we can't just talk about these people as if they're crazy and be like, well, I would never join a cult. You really don't know, and you might actually, if you've got these different characteristics, you could find yourself in a cult. So this is why we need to maintain a level of empathy for these people. Okay, so let's talk about how they're able to go about getting people and keeping people in their cults. So I have read from various experts in this field that they don't like the term brainwashing. The technical term is thought control and thought reform. So there's a few different models out there. And the first thing I saw was there's these 6 characteristics to thought reform. So this is by a Dr. Margaret Singer, who is, or was rather, an expert in the field of cult psychology and sociology and human behavior and thought reform. And so she calls this her 6 conditions to create the right atmosphere. Number 1, keep the person unaware of what is going on. You need to lead them step by step through a behavioral change program without them knowing the final agenda. Number 2 is to control their environment and, more importantly, control their time. If members are kept busy and thinking about the cult as much as possible, they'll be easier to bring into the fold. 3, creating a sense of powerlessness in them. These are things like removing them from their normal support network, their friends and family, removing their means of income, or requiring that they donate their income to the group, speaking in in-group language, attacking their previous worldview, basically keeping them busy and tired. Number 4 is to manipulate a system of rewards, punishments, and experiences to inhibit behavior reflective of their former identity, morals, and ethics. So old beliefs are defined as either evil or irrelevant in this new worldview and in this group. And there is positive feedback for conforming to the group ideology and negative feedback for dissenting with the group ideology. Number 5 is promoting learning of the group's ideology, their belief system, and like the in-group behaviors. To do this, the only feedback that a group member gets is from other group members or from cult leadership. Good behavior and compliance is continued to be rewarded to the point that eventually a group member is dependent upon getting that reward of their good behavior. Human beings are wired to do this, to seek out positive reinforcement and avoid negative reinforcement. So if you think about it like that, you can start to understand how people will totally stray from their moral compass. And 6 is to create a closed system of logic. Authoritarian structure power systems, they don't allow for any type of feedback, and they refuse to be modified. There tends to be a top-down pyramid structure, and members are not allowed to question the leadership and their decisions. They're not allowed to criticize or ever complain. Essentially, the individual is the one that's always wrong, and the system or leader is always right. Another model I found is called the BITE model, and this is a quick and easy way that you can try to evaluate a group and see where does this fall on the spectrum of totally normal to a cult. So it stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. Behavioral control. This is to regulate their physical reality, to dictate the everyday details of their lives, the big and the small decisions. This might be like manipulating or depriving sleep, requiring permission to even like eat meals or to get dressed for the day, and imposing really rigid rules and regulations. Information control basically comes down to deception or omission, withholding important information or lying, minimizing and restricting access to non-cult sources of information, encouraging spying on other members, and the excessive use of cult propaganda. Thought control requires that members adopt the group ideology belief system as the truth. It instills black and white thinking, like an us versus them mentality. They might even change a person's name and identity in order to feel like fitting in with the group, and forbidding critical questions about the group leader or their policy. Then lastly, we've got emotional control. So some emotions are deemed as evil or bad or wrong. The problems are always the fault of the individual and not of the leader, promoting feelings of guilt or unworthiness, the threat of shunning, and terrible consequences to the ex-member if they leave or to their family. Lastly, let's talk about the language of cults. This is another way that they're able to deceive people and bring them in and keep them there. So 2 really good resources. One is the book Cultish by Amanda Montell. Her father actually grew up in a cult, and she is a linguist, I believe. And then there was an article I found in The Atlantic called "We Choose Our Cults Every Day." So let's talk about, what does cult language do? What is its intention? Number one is it makes people feel unique, but also that they are connected to others. It encourages people to feel dependent on the group, their leader, or product, to the point where they feel like life is almost impossible without them. And like, how did they ever live before? And it's a way to convince people to act in a way that totally does not reflect their previous ethics, morals, or decision making in their prior life, and to kind of reset what they feel are normal behaviors, beliefs, and ethics. So let's talk about the methods of language and sort of the style. So that's how they're able to go about this. Things like creating a sense of intrigue, creating a sense of camaraderie, using code words to separate the residents from like people outside of the group, making up nicknames for outsiders, choosing new names so that you all have taken on a new identity within the group. There is one cult, if you've watched the Wild Wild Country documentary on Netflix, they all chose a new name where they all had the same last name and then they picked a new first name. Using thought terminating cliches, which is like the creation of like really a positive affinity with the group. Things like trust the plan, or the awakening is bigger than all of your problems. And then the opposite of that is something called semantic stop signs, which is a cue to halt independent inquiry and kind of get back in line with conforming to the group's beliefs and ideology. I also found some really interesting articles about the style of sermons, so like the grammar used in sermons, the style of delivery, even keywords that tend to be used in like cult services or sermons. They tend to be highly elaborative. They use othering, buzzwords, third-person pronouns, interestingly enough, frequent use of negativity, which is meant to reinforce like restricting behavior and thoughts of the group members. And then a lot of times they'll include things like chanting or singing. They also tend to use deception techniques with their language. So omitting what you need to know and instead using like highly elaborative descriptions and explanations to create this sense of deception. They'll distort things and sort of maybe tell white lies here and there to outright lies to make things sound more believable and accepting. And then once you're fully in, you get to the point where it's just outright lies. And then some interesting keywords that tend to pop up. So I found some journal articles that they evaluated sermons given by different cult leaders. So people like Jim Jones and the cult leaders of Heaven's Gate. So these are things like kingdom, vehicle, level, human being, and overcoming. So on their own, these words, these keywords, these style of speaking aren't necessarily nefarious, but you can see how by using thought control techniques and picking on the exact right type of person, isolating them, and then layering on this language, it can go from, oh, I found this group of people who understand me and I belong, to very quickly becoming something nefarious and outright evil, and in many times illegal. So that's really just the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, this is an entire field of study. There are people who've gotten their whole PhDs on evaluating high pressure, high reform groups and the language used and the thought control behaviors. So you can check out some of those resources I mentioned. I'll put some links down in the bio. This video is already long enough, so I will make a part 2 video where we talk about books, fiction books and nonfiction, docuseries, documentaries, podcasts, etc. if you are interested in learning more about cults or about specific cults. Again, please try and keep the comments respectful and try to keep a level of empathy. I'm hoping now after you've watched this video, you can have a little bit more understanding of how like everyday normal people can find themselves sucked into a bad situation and understand that it could happen to you. That's everything I have for you today. If you are not subscribed, I'd appreciate if you would subscribe so you get notifications of when my new videos come out. Have a good one.